Assault on New Phyrexia, Episode 1, Uncontrolled Desscent. A Magic the Gathering story by Seanan McGuire. Kaido couldn't have answered if someone had asked him what he was expecting to find in New Phyrexia. The information they had going in was too scant in some places, and no one still living had ever witnessed a fully completed plane. They had their intel and their recon and everything they could have to prepare them for the incursion, but he still didn't know what he'd been expecting, only, roughly, what he hadn't been. He certainly hadn't been expecting a feeling like slamming into a wall of electrostatic wind, not enough to do actual damage, but enough to disorient, to distract, and inevitably, to steal consciousness away. And now that it had happened, he certainly hadn't been expecting New Phyrexia to look like one of the nicer tourist beaches of Kamigawa. What he could see of New Phyrexia was all pristine sand without a sign that anything more dangerous than sunbathing had ever happened here. It was pleasant. So pleasant. New Phyrexia wasn't a peril, it was a paradise, and he should just relax and let it wash over him like a wave from the welcoming sea. The crashing of that sea rang in his ears as he closed his eyes and sank deeper into the sand. Part of him knew Phyrexia would recognize his presence soon and react the way any dangerous beast reacted to an intruder. A small speck of unaddled coherence at the edge of his consciousness screamed at him to wake up, snap out of it. Phyrexia was a danger. He wouldn't be here if Phyrexia wasn't a danger. Kamigawa was under threat, and he had to do whatever was within his power to protect everything he ever cared about. His friends, his plane, his sister. He came here to save them all. But the sand was warm and inviting, and he couldn't find it in himself to move until small, strong hands grabbed him by the shoulders and jerked him into a sitting position. They felt familiar, like hands that he should know. They also felt like an attack, and so he thrashed, trying to pull away. The small, screaming corner of his mind screamed even louder, trying to remind him that fighting back should have been his first thought, his first reaction to even a whisper of hostile action, but no, only futile thrashing seemed to suit. One of those small, strong hands released his shoulder, and he was able to pull briefly free, ready to sink back into peace and pleasure, before it slammed into his cheek, striking him just below the eye so hard that he heard the crack as much as he felt it. He recoiled, eyes jerking open, and for the first time, he realized that what he'd taken for the sound of waves was actually the sound of metal clashing on metal, spells impacting their targets, and grunts of exertion. Someone screamed, and he knew, without question, that before the blow he would have heard it as some kind of seabird flying overhead, if he'd been able to hear it at all. "There," said the wanderer with some satisfaction, releasing his other shoulder and shaking the impact out of her hand, knuckles reddened but otherwise unscathed. "I was wondering when you were going to join us." "Join?" Kaido paused, thoughts flickering back to the wall of static wind. The wall he had remembered as pleasant, even peaceful, only a moment before. But it hadn't been, had it? It had been something he couldn't remember, except for the sound of screams. Some of them might even have been his own. He grabbed instinctively for his sword, body suddenly flooded with the adrenaline that should have been there all along, and froze as he realized his equipment was gone. No sword, no small, friendly spirit emulating a tanuki drone in form and function. Phyrexia had slapped him down when he should have been untouchable and stripped him bare in the same instant. His eyes flicked back to the wanderer, just in time to catch her momentarily disappearing, guttering out like a dying candle. "No," he said, shaking his head fiercely. "No. You need more time. I need more time. You can't go before you tell me what I missed." "A barrier," she said. "We didn't expect it, and it seems to have blocked my ability to anchor myself. Can't stay here. Losing grasp. Have to tell you." A look of profound frustration crossed her face, and she turned, shouting at a point slightly beyond Kaido's right shoulder, "Nahiri! Stop toying with that thing." Kaido turned, Loath as he was to take his eyes off the wanderer when she was so close to vanishing, and beheld Nahiri, sword in hand and cheeks faintly flushed with exertion, the heat of her blood showing through the slaty tone of her skin. She was dancing, no, fighting with a figure that looked to have been shaped from liquid metal spliced with panels of wiry cabling, like a fever dream of mechanical poetry escaped from the inventor's bench and turned against the world. It seemed impossible that anyone, even the lithomancer, could fight this construction and win. Then the air flashed around her, igniting with a crash as loud as thunder, as Nahiri called the glittering metallic sand of New Phyrexia to join her dance. It rose grain by grain to swirl around her, a storm even deadlier than her hail of shaped stone blades, and crashed together on the fighting figure, overwhelming it as sand invaded exposed machinery and nasal passages alike, putting down Nahiri's opponent in the blink of an eye. As it fell, Nahiri was there, stepping forward and driving her primary blade home, through the center of the creature. She twisted once, and the shape beneath the mounded sand was Nahiri could be confusing that way. He didn't know her well enough to tease her meaning out of everything she said yet, and wasn't sure, under the circumstances, that he was going to get the chance. They trudged across the sand that wasn't anything of the sort when Kaido looked at it more closely. What he'd been taking for a seashore was an infinite desert of particulate metal, pieces of Mirrodin ground into fine dust by Phyrexian power. The wanderer paced beside him, flicking and silent, clearly spending all her energy on remaining in tune with the plane. He glanced once again to Nahiri. "Nothing here is what it looks like," she said, voice brusque. "You can't trust anything Phyrexian. It's all lying to you, all the time, whether it knows it or not. Keep moving." Kaido kept moving. The desert stretched out ahead of them, extending to the distant base of a massive, incomprehensible monument built according to some twisted parody of geometry. They pressed on into the shadow of the titanic monument, a tiny trio of attackers moving through a hostile land, and nothing else moved, and they were alone, and the oppressive weight of Phyrexia was all around them, and they were never going to be alone again. The landscape grew more and more ordered as they pressed on, terrible in its alien symmetries. Vast constructs of gleaming metal cast their shadows across the shining ground, celebrating unthinkable victories, glistening in spots with exposed flesh that made Kaido's skin crawl. Were they leftover structures from Mirrodin, or the sleeping forms of Phyrexian Goliaths? Some mysteries were better left unsolved. At least Mirrodin's 5 suns still shone, dim through the dense fog. The group rounded the terminus of a low wall that seemed to have been forged from half-melted bone mixed with silver and stopped at the sight of a stone statue hanging suspended between 2 iron pillars in a tangle of steel-sheened cables, said Tyver, voice bright in the cool, still air. "We came following Karn and the Gatewatch's call, but we were lost on arrival, and you're the first friendly faces we've seen. Are there others like us here?" "Ah," said the woman, understanding. "I'd heard rumors Alesh Norn was setting up some sort of defense barrier against people like you. Guess she got it up and running. The rest of your people should be gathering 2 layers down, in the furnace, assuming they made it that far." She began moving away from the small encampment, gesturing for the 3 of them to follow. "This is the monumental facade," she said. "When the Phyrexians took Mirrodin, they built a shell around our plane, trapping those of us who'd survived to keep fighting underneath. We wouldn't be allowed to see the suns from our original home any longer. This is where they send their toys to fight each other to the death, but we came up to find you. You would have had a harder journey if we hadn't been here, drawing fire and trying to make sure nothing got away to report our location." "So, Phyrexia didn't have surveillance everywhere?" Kaido nodded, taking this as some of the first good news they'd received since arriving. "Mirrodin, the real Mirrodin, is beneath us," Melira continued. She stopped at the center of an oddly flat patch of ground, looking at each of them in turn before finally focusing on Nahiri. "You're the lithomancer they said was coming, yeah?" "I am," said Nahiri, knives shifting in the air around her. "Why?" "It'll help, that's all," said Melira, and she slammed the butt of her staff down on the center of the clear patch. There was a momentary pause, long enough for Melira to look annoyed and glance over her shoulder like she was waiting for something, and then the ground dropped out from under their feet as a roughly 10-foot square of what Melira called the monumental facade crumpled inward. "Why are you laughing? We could have all been killed." "Koth said you were powerful mages come to save the plane," said Melira. "Well, the facade's shell breaks all the time, with or without our help. If you couldn't handle a little fall, you weren't going to succeed anyway. Though this is better than I would have hoped. Once we touch down, we'll be near lowlight, we can make for the lacuna and head into the furnace layer to meet the rest of the survivors." Kaido didn't like that word. Survivors felt like a premonition, and with the Wanderer already gone, it wasn't something he wanted to think about. Still, he schooled his expression to neutrality. "We're very grateful for your help," he said, and glanced to Nahiri, waiting for her to say that she'd been injured when she and the Wanderer had found him in the sand. She did nothing of the sort, keeping all her focus on guiding them to a landing. It had only been a scratch, after all. Better not to break her concentration for a scratch when it was nothing that required healing. Tyver had other questions. He waved a hand, indicating the land around them. "We descend farther? Is this not the furnace layer?" "No," said Melira. "The Phyrexians call this Myrix. They can't even allow us the grace of our true name. I told you the real Mirrodin was beneath us. This is all that remains of our home." "I see," said Tyver, subdued. "The main force of our assault teams will be gathered in lowlight, ready to aid you in your efforts," said Melira. "There's no price too great for us to pay for a free Mirrodin. This was a beautiful land once. Fate allowing, it will be again." "For Mirrodin, and the multiverse," Kaido said, and Melira smiled at him in brief unity before moving to look over the edge of Nahiri's makeshift platform. Mirrodin, what remained of it, was a wasteland beneath them, withered from lack of light, without even the alien beauty of the surface. If Phyrexia had done this to break the spirit of the resistance, they had probably come closer than anyone wanted to believe. Nahiri guided their makeshift conveyance to a stop on the surface, looking to Melira. "Is the whole place like this?" "It'll take us down to the furnace layer. We would have released it soon, assuming no one was coming." "Then we go down," said Nahiri. Melira looked halfway amused. "Have any of you used one of these before?" "No," said Kaido. "They're fun," she said. "They play games with gravity internally, so you don't fall beyond that first jump. Starting off is always harder than continuing." Melira strode toward the lacuna, easily stepping up the series of crates that had been stacked next to the wall, and leapt off. The Planswalkers followed her. Upon climbing the same crates and looking down, they saw her standing on the floor of a tunnel of some sort, dropping into the depths of Phyrexia, lit from within by a pale, sourceless illumination. She looked back over her shoulder at them. "Well?" she asked. "Are you doing this?" Nahiri leapt without hesitation, and Kaido jumped after her. There was a moment of sickening disorientation, and then he was standing on the wall of the tunnel. Looking back, Tyver was the one who looked like he was positioned in defiance of gravity, something the big man clearly realized, because he laughed and jumped into the lacuna. "Onward, friends," he said, and strode forward. Kaido paced him, and in short order, the pair had passed Nahiri, descending into Phyrexian soil. Melira hung back slightly with Nahiri, glancing at the bandage on the back of the other woman's neck, but not asking, "Not yet." Nahiri didn't feel right. She was familiar with her body and the way it was meant to come together, bones and tissues laced like stones in good soil, and right now, something felt awry. The cut at the back of her neck, the small, inconsequential injury, throbbed, intruding on her awareness more than anything so minor had the right to. She hung back a little, allowing Melira to pass her, before she reached behind herself to feel the bandage she'd taken from Kaido's pack. The gauze was oddly bunched, as if something had pressed against it from below. Peeling back the bandage, She touched the surface beneath with delicate fingers and found no injury, only smooth skin and a short, slick protrusion that had no business growing there, as if her bones had decided to reshape themselves. She pulled her hand away with a hiss of dismay, somehow unsurprised to see that they gleamed with the same glistening oil as had tipped the spears of the Phyrexians. She was infected. She was already lost. She knew she should tell her companions, but how? And what good would it do any of them to know? They couldn't kill her, and if they tried, she would fight back, regardless of her condition. She couldn't leave, or she would carry the taint away from this doomed and dying plane to infect another. The Mirren was supposedly a healer, but even a healer couldn't stop this, could they? No, it was best to get them as far as she possibly could before she succumbed and became something that was easier for them to destroy. Pressing the bandage back down, she recovered the wound, and pressed onward. The Mirren camp, small as it had been, was razed and gone when the white-haired woman in the wide-brimmed hat appeared, looking warily around, sword at the ready. Nothing moved or motioned to attack her. "Kaito," she cried. "Kaito, are you here?" Nothing answered. A patch of ground had fallen inward not far away, and the wanderer ran toward it, recognizing it for what it was. She peered down into the depths and saw no sign of her companions, only rubble on the distant Mirren ground. They were gone. She had returned from the blind eternities too late, and they were lost. "I could have warned them," she moaned. "They have no idea what they're walking into. We were naive to think this could be so easily achieved." She straightened. Her time on this plane would be brief. If she was going to see them again, she would. Until that happened, all she could do was wait for her departure and hope for their safety. It wouldn't be enough. It had to be enough. It was all she had.